This is the vlog for August 14th, 2018. And tomorrow is my last vlog here in Washington before my 4 days-ish in 3 nights, I should say, in Iowa at Lake Okoboji, the old lake. I'm sure I have waxed poetic about Okoboji before, but it is something special. The lake where Grandpa and Grandma had a cabin. I know not a lot of people in America have that sort of experience, and I always saw myself as being fairly middle class, although a lot of people would say I was actually quite upper class given the amount of money my father made as a pilot. And I think it's sort of relative, because the ridiculous amounts of money that people make working software in this area pale in comparison to what a pilot tends to make. But in Minnesota, that was one of the highest paying jobs that you could have. And a lot of people in my neighborhood were actually the families of pilots, as it turns out. I didn't even realize that back then. My dad mentioned it in passing one time. But my dad, as well off as he was, came from a very humble beginning. His parents, my grandparents, were teachers. Both Grandma June and Grandpa Bill were teachers. Grandpa Bill was a paratrooper in the Army during World War II and served in the Pacific Theater. He was part of a huge rescue operation for prisoners of war, and served in the honor guard of General MacArthur when Tokyo surrendered. I should say Japan surrendered. But it was always their dream, my grandma and grandpa, to have a cabin at the lake. They pinched and they saved, and they did whatever they could, and for the princely sum of what my dad says was probably $4,500, purchased a bit of land at the lake that was fairly close to the canals that fed into the lake. And upon that land, they built a cabin. And the old cabin eventually got, I believe, bulldozed entirely. And to hear my dad say it, it was a mercy. The old cabin it showed that it was made by a couple of people who didn't know much about making houses. The floor was uneven. The walls were a little weird. I think some of them were actually tilted slightly inward. It had one big sort of living, eating space that was, part of it was a kitchen that was sort of on a platform compared to the rest. So you sort of stepped down into the living room, and you stepped down further depending on which side of the platform you got off of because of how uneven. It was literally the most uneven floor I have ever encountered, because the first time I found it, I was 2 or 3, and I noticed it. Having never experienced uneven floors before in my life, I was going, "Oh, this is like a hill." I rolled a ball up and down, and I was young enough that Grandma and Grandpa had not had a lot of experience with me, so they thought they were tickled pink by me. And Mom and Dad were happy to just have a... They told me the great thing about seeing Grandma and Grandpa is that they would happily take care of me in the evening so that they could go out, which was something that they had not had a lot of chances to do after I was born. And so they... There's a fly. There's a fly that's stuck in here. It's been pretty quiet so far. If it starts buzzing, I might go a little crazy. They left me with Grandma and Grandpa, and they went and saw the Ups and Downs, just a classic jazz band at probably Palmer Park. There's a bunch of little townlets and stops more than anything. Not really towns so much as places where you can buy stuff. between the large residential areas along the lake. Okoboji, I think I've already mentioned, is part of a sort of trio. There's Spirit Lake, Big Spirit Lake, and Okoboji. And I've heard them described as the Great Lakes of Iowa, which is being very generous because they are quite small compared to the actual Great Lakes in North America. But like I said, they're special to me. They're a place where when you go there, there's nothing. There's nothing but the lake and your family. And with nothing to sort of distract you, but what you bring with you, if you feel so inclined, it is incredibly soothing. Much more so than having a fly buzzing around your head. God, that doesn't even look like... Oh, that's a fly. Yeah. But one of the first times I went back as an adult, there was a whole decade where I'd not gone to Okoboji because we'd been living out here and I was going to college. The whole time I was in high school, I don't remember ever going to Okoboji. My family did. My parents would go, and then even occasionally my sister would go, but I stayed behind. I don't know exactly why. But after college, after I'd first started working at Nintendo for a couple of years, we decided to do a big family reunion at Okoboji, and for whatever reason, it was even further than that. It must have been like 2010. I was inspired by a show I was watching imported from Japan called Kamen Rider Double that was heavily inspired by the noir detective fiction of Philip Marlowe. So I bought The Long Goodbye and spent the whole weekend reading that while I was at the lake, and it was so warm, a little bit humid, and then a thunderstorm would roll in on Friday night and just dump rain and make a racket and cool everything off on Saturday. It was nice. But I just sat and read, the power didn't go off, which is kind of a rarity. So I was reading. I think the first night, the Thursday that we flew in, is when I was reading the most. And having flown on a plane for at least 2.5, maybe 3 hours, and then spending 4 hours in a car, driving from the airport down to Okoboji, I was very tired. My body was used to Seattle time, so I was, what do you say, 2 hours behind. So I wanted to sleep in. I wanted to sleep in the morning after we had traveled. I'd forgotten that Grandma and Grandpa's old cabin was located next to a game preserve where wild turkeys grow. So imagine my shock on Friday morning in a very warm cabin when I wake to hear it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a human being making a turkey noise. And so I thought one of my cousins or one of my uncles was having a bit of fun with me. So I crawled out of bed to see which one of those assholes had decided to give me grief. And I found out it was an actual turkey. And if there had been anything like a baseball bat or a lead pipe, I would have provided a turkey dinner for my family and then been arrested for poaching. Thankfully, none of those things were available, so I simply got up and the gobbling eventually subsided, and I went along with my day. But the rest of the weekend was actually quite pleasant. I read an awful lot of that book. I think I finished it before we flew home, or I think I finished it on the flight home. And if you ever find yourself in need of true relaxation, might I recommend bringing nothing but a book to a trip down to a lake. Oh gosh, I need to find a book. Well, then, I'll leave you at that and say that I am Eric Spornitz, and tomorrow will be better.